Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown, because some truths are hidden in the dark. The sky above Earth darkened at noon, swallowing the sun in a shifting veil of metal. It was neither an eclipse nor a storm, but something far worse. The arrival of an empire that had never known resistance. They came without announcement, without warning. No grand demands, no proclamations of dominion. Just the silent descent of an enemy that considered victory a certainty. The crushing inevitability of a power that had swallowed civilizations before humanity had even begun to map its own stars. The Zarthan fleet filled the upper atmosphere, their ships vast as cities, their surfaces cold and gleaming under the weight of their own gravity fields. They did not shimmer with artificial lights or bear markings of allegiance. Their design was not meant to be beautiful or intimidating. It was purely functional, a construct of war and conquest, built for efficiency, not spectacle. The world looked up, breath held, minds frozen in the moment before impact. The attack came not in waves, but in a single, calculated strike. An unseen pulse flickered across the sky, a whisper of power so immense that it could not be felt, only observed in its aftermath. Every satellite went dark at once. The global internet, a system interwoven through continents, collapsed in mere seconds. Power grids failed as cascading shutdowns rippled outward, plunging entire nations into darkness. Airports fell silent as control towers lost contact with their pilots. Cities, just moments ago vibrant with movement, turned into still-life portraits of confusion. Panic came next, first as a murmur, then as a wave. And then they landed. The Zarthan did not move like invaders. They did not descend in chaotic fire, nor did they revel in destruction. They were precise, cold, methodical. They arrived in massive drop ships, unfolding from their vessels with the seamless efficiency of a well-oiled machine. 10 feet tall, their frames a fusion of biometal and organic tissue. They moved as one, an army bred not for emotion or hesitation, but for pure conquest. Their faces, if they could be called that, were smooth and expressionless, their eyes nothing more than data receptors feeding tactical analysis into their neural systems. The first defenses fell within minutes. Fighter jets, scrambling from their bases, were intercepted before they could even take formation. Missiles were neutralized mid-air, their trajectories altered by unseen forces. Tanks, relics of an older war, melted under the silent pressure of directed energy weapons, their hulking forms left steaming in the streets like discarded carcasses. It was not a battle. It was extermination. Across the world, governments collapsed in hours. Nations that had spent centuries preparing for war found themselves outmaneuvered in mere moments. Leaders disappeared. Some fled, some surrendered, some simply ceased to be. No nuclear retaliation came. Every launch site had been neutralized before human hands could even reach the keys. The Zarthan did not hesitate. To them, this was not conquest. It was the systematic reorganization of a lesser species, the natural progression of a superior force, claiming dominion over those too weak to resist. But conquest requires understanding, and that was their first mistake. At dawn on the second day, the Zarthan commander stood among the ruins of what had once been Washington, D.C. His form was draped in liquid metal, a material that shifted with his movement, reflecting the cold gray of the ruined cityscape around him. The White House was nothing but smoldering wreckage behind him, its significance meaningless to a race that did not understand the weight of human symbols. His gaze swept the horizon, taking in the battlefield. Something was off. The humans had stopped fighting conventionally. There were no more organized battalions, no formations, no counterstrikes that followed the logical flow of war. Instead, their movements had fractured. Soldiers abandoned their regiments, civilians took up arms, and resistance began to surge not in concentrated locations, but in every darkened alley, every collapsed structure, every underground tunnel. The Zarthan did not understand chaos. They were programmed for efficiency, for predictable patterns. What they faced now defied their calculations. And then the whispers began. At first, they were dismissed as interference, corrupted signals bleeding through their communication networks. But the interference did not follow expected patterns. It was not random noise. It was deliberate. A single phrase, repeated in perfect Zarthonian, embedded itself into their encrypted channels. You are not safe. It came in pulses, sometimes through radio waves, sometimes through their own neural networks. Some Zarthan reported hearing it, even when their comms were off. Battle directives began rewriting themselves mid-execution. Soldiers received conflicting orders. Squads were dispatched to eliminate enemies that did not exist, to defend locations already secured. Entire strike teams vanished, lured into dead-end tunnels where their advanced weaponry became useless in the suffocating dark. Then came the sabotage. Zarthan warships, impervious to conventional artillery, were brought down not by missiles, but by human ingenuity. Children, yes, children, planted crude explosives in the exhaust vents of low-hovering vessels, using nothing more than the tools they had scavenged from the wreckage. Engineers, working in hidden basements, repurposed downed alien drones, turning their own technology against them. Hackers infiltrated their command networks, issuing false retreat orders to entire battalions. And through it all, the Zarthan made one terrible realization. The humans were not afraid. A captured soldier, his uniform torn, his face streaked with blood, was brought before a Zarthan officer. The aliens studied him, searching for the trembling, the pleading, the resignation that had come so naturally from other conquered species. But the man did not cower. He did not beg. He grinned. "You're scared, aren't you?" he said, voice steady measured. Not a challenge. Not bravado. A statement. The Zarthan did not respond, because for the first time in their long history, they did not know how to. Hesitation. A single moment of it. A fracture in the perfect efficiency of their war machine. And in war, hesitation is fatal. The Zarthan prided themselves on precision. They were an empire of control, of flawless execution, of wars won before the first strike was even made. Their enemies never stood a chance because their wars were not battles. They were equations. Inputs, outputs, probabilities. A species was either strong enough to be assimilated into the empire or weak enough to be erased. There was no in-between, no uncertainty. But this war did not fit the equation. Orzith Kal stood within the temporary command post, deep inside the skeletal remains of a city that had once housed millions. The structure, some kind of human administrative complex, was gutted by fire and battle. He did not care for its history or significance. It was a place to issue orders, nothing more. A hollow display hovered before him, filled with glowing Zarthonian script. Data scrolled endlessly, tactical assessments, intercepted communications, casualty reports. Each line was another inconsistency, another error in the once flawless plan. The humans were still fighting. That in itself was not unusual. Many species resisted. What was unusual was how they were fighting, how their actions defied every known military doctrine. The reports were filled with anomalies. Small resistance cells that should have been eradicated simply vanishing. Patrols lured into dead zones where they were picked off one by one. Sabotage efforts that showed a level of technological understanding the humans should not have possessed. Even the air itself seemed to betray them. Communications fell into static without cause. Their neural links were plagued by ghost signals, whispering things that should not be. He turned sharply as a subordinate entered, the soldier's heavy frame casting a shadow against the flickering remnants of human light fixtures. The Zarthan did not hesitate in their movements, but this soldier hesitated. A fraction of a second. A delay imperceptible to anyone but him. Report. Orzith Kal's voice was sharp, clipped. The hesitation displeased him. The soldier straightened, but Orzith Kal could see it. The stiffness in his stance, the slight faltering of his neural relay as he spoke. Sector 7 compromised. Ambush. Unknown resistance members. One squad lost. Another squad lost. Another failure. Define unknown resistance members. The soldier's jaw tensed. No confirmed identities. The humans are disguising their forces. Patterns do not align with military personnel. They fight like a brief pause. They fight like civilians. A lesser being might have shown shock. Orzithcal merely processed. Civilians. That word had no meaning to him. In the Zarthan Empire, there was no distinction between warrior and worker, soldier and scientist. Every being had a purpose, defined and unyielding. The concept of a non-combatant taking up arms in any capacity outside of calculated military structure was incomprehensible. He dismissed the soldier with a wave. As the heavy footsteps receded down the corridor, Orzithcal turned his gaze back to the hollow display, fingers tightening against the metal surface of the console. This was not an error in strategy. This was something deeper. The humans did not fight like an army. They fought like a species that refused to be categorized. Their survival was not a probability equation. It was something else, something worse. From the street below, a sound drifted up through the broken windows. Laughter. Not the cruel, victorious laughter of conquerors. The low, unshaken amusement of something that should have been afraid but wasn't. Orzithcal felt something shift in the deepest part of his neural framework, something cold and mechanical, something that had never once failed him. He ignored it. Outside the command post, the city burned. In the tunnels beneath the ruins, a different kind of fire was spreading. A man crouched in the dim glow of a scavenged interface, his hands moving rapidly over a cracked screen. The stolen Zarthan device pulsed with alien energy, its displays unreadable to most, but not to him. He had spent his entire life working in human technology sectors, breaking into systems designed to be impenetrable. Alien code was just another puzzle. The resistance had learned fast. They had no choice. A voice crackled through his headset. "Tell me you've got something." "I've got something," he muttered, not looking away from the screen. "But you're not going to like it." A sigh. "Then just say it." The Zarthan network isn't just failing. It's fighting itself. His fingers tapped a rapid sequence, pulling up lines of distorted script. Their system keeps running conflicting directives. It's like something's rewriting their orders before they can process them. Another voice cut in, this one sharper, female. "Are you telling me someone already hacked them?" "I'm telling you someone, or something, is making sure they don't win." Silence. The implications were staggering. The resistance had taken down ships, disabled patrols, disrupted their chain of command, but this was different. This wasn't human ingenuity. This was something else. A slow breath. Then the woman's voice, steadier now. "Keep digging. If there's something inside their system screwing with them, I want to know what it is." The connection cut, leaving only the hum of static. Above, the Zarthan forces moved like a machine beginning to rust. Their perfect synchronization just slightly off, their flawless execution marred by something unseen. The smallest delays, the slightest hesitations. An empire built on certainty forced to wade through uncertainty. And in the ruins, the resistance watched. They were not stronger. They were not faster. They did not have the technology, the numbers, or the tactical superiority. But they had something else. They had doubt. They had patience. And they had a war to win. The war had become a paradox. The Zarthan, a species that had never known disarray, now found themselves suffocating in it. Their efficiency, once unshakable, had eroded into hesitation. Their strategies, honed over millennia, collapsed under the weight of unpredictability. Orzithcal did not understand failure. He had studied countless conquests, had seen civilizations reduced to mere footnotes in Zarthan history, absorbed or erased. Humanity should have been no different. They were outnumbered, outgunned, their infrastructure crumbling beneath the calculated precision of the invasion. And yet, they did not fall as expected. They did not surrender, nor did they mount a last, desperate stand. They adapted. Their resistance was not centralized, not bound by hierarchy or doctrine. It moved like a shifting current, slipping through the cracks of logic itself. The supreme strategist stood on the remains of a collapsed highway, his silhouette framed by the burning ruins of the human capital. His neural interface streamed with conflicting reports. Patrols had gone missing, vanished without traces of struggle. Supply lines had been severed, not by force, but by unseen hands that rewrote directives mid-execution. Entire squadrons reported false readings, pursuing ghosts that led them into ambushes. His army, bred for precision, was unraveling in the face of chaos. He exhaled, a slow, measured sound that came through the filters of his armor. If his mind had been engineered with a flaw, it was that it had never been made to process the illogical. And this war had become illogical. A transmission flickered into his private channel, bypassing security layers that should have been unbreakable. The voice that spoke was not Zarthonian. It was human, calm, unrushed. You should leave while you still can. Orzith Kal said nothing. He let the silence stretch between them. Silence had power. He had interrogated countless enemies in the past, had learned that words were not the only way to extract information. People feared silence. They filled it with their own uncertainties, their own mistakes. But this human did not. You're wondering how long you can hold out, the voice continued. Wondering if your troops can be recalibrated, if you can still turn this around. A pause. You can't. His neural interface flared with location markers, triangulating the source. The humans had become adept at masking their transmissions, but nothing was perfect. He traced the signal, narrowing its origin to the ruins beneath the city, an old transit hub repurposed into a war room. Finally, he spoke. You assume too much. The voice chuckled, a deliberate, knowing sound. Do I? The transmission cut. Orzith Kal's gaze remained fixed on the distance, his mind already calculating. A trap, most likely, but it did not matter. He would crush them, not with brute force, but with something they could not adapt to. He would strip away their illusions. Deep beneath the city, the Resistance war room buzzed with quiet intensity. The chamber had once been a maintenance station for underground transport, its walls reinforced against collapse. Now it served as a command center for ghosts. Engineers, hackers, soldiers without ranks. They had no leader in the traditional sense. Orders were suggestions, plans debated rather than dictated. And yet, they functioned with terrifying efficiency. The man who had spoken to Orzith Kal removed his headset, exhaling slowly. He had expected the Zarthan to respond, to attempt intimidation, threats. Instead, the alien had simply listened, calculated. That made him dangerous. Across the room, a woman studied a map of the city's remaining infrastructure. Her fingers traced the points where Zarthan control was weakest. You think he took the bait? The man shook his head. He took a bait. Whether it's the one we wanted him to take is another question. She frowned. We need to end this before they adapt again. Agreed. He turned back to the screen, analyzing the data streaming in from their infiltration systems. Something's already destabilizing them. We just need to push harder. Another voice, younger, sharp-edged, cut in. And if we push too hard? What if they decide Earth isn't worth the effort and start glassing cities? Silence. That was the fear, wasn't it? That the Zarthan, cornered and desperate, would abandon conquest for annihilation. The fact that they hadn't already meant something was holding them back. Something else. Then we make sure they can't, the woman said finally. We give them a reason to retreat. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The war had never been about winning in the traditional sense. It was about making the cost of staying greater than the cost of leaving. Above, the Zarthan war machine moved into position, converging toward the coordinates Orzith Kal had extracted. But the ground they walked on was not just earth and stone. It was a battlefield designed against them, a trap they had already stepped into, and the war was no longer theirs to control. The air smelled of burning steel and charred earth. Smoke curled into the sky in thick, choking ribbons, the remnants of another Zarthan offensive that had yielded nothing but more dead. The city's ruins stretched for miles, broken towers casting jagged shadows against the dimming horizon. Once, this place had pulsed with life, its streets crowded with the endless rhythm of human existence. Now, it was a corpse of concrete and fire, a graveyard where the living refused to lie still. Orzith Kal stood at the heart of it, unmoving. His armor, once pristine, bore the scars of a war that should have ended days ago. The heat from the smoldering wreckage did not reach him. His body, engineered for endurance, did not fatigue. But something beneath the surface, some part of his mind untouched by genetic perfection, felt the weight of this place. He listened, not to his soldiers, who moved with precision around him, not to the distant hum of war machines circling overhead, but to the silence, the kind that did not belong on a battlefield. It was the absence of movement, of chatter, of the usual residue of war. The humans were watching. He could not see them, but he knew they were there, waiting. A transmission flickered in his neural interface. The voice on the other end belonged to one of his lieutenants, crisp and disciplined. Perimeter secured. No sign of movement. Orzathal's gaze swept over the crumbling buildings, the shattered roads. No sign of movement did not mean absence. It meant camouflage. He had learned that much. Hold your position, he commanded. They will come. Because that was the pattern, wasn't it? They struck not when expected, not when it was strategically sound, but when it was least logical. They turned certainty into vulnerability. They used fear as a weapon, not their own, but the Zarthans, the fear of the unknown, of disorder. He had underestimated them. They had studied his kind, learned their rigid structures, their unwavering faith in calculation, and they had twisted it against them. But adaptation was not a solely human trait. He could change too. He would change. Beneath the ruins, the resistance gathered. A woman crouched beside a console patched together from scavenged Zarthan tech, its alien interface flickering under her fingertips. The screen displayed data pulled directly from the invaders' own systems. Troop movements, supply lines, the pulse of an empire that was beginning to falter. The man beside her watched intently, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "They're holding," she muttered. "They're waiting," he corrected. "They know we're here." She exhaled sharply, tapping a command into the console. "They don't know enough." The screen shifted, revealing a map of the city's underground network, a tangled web of tunnels and collapsed infrastructure. It had been a logistical nightmare before the war, an overlooked flaw in human planning. Now it was their greatest advantage. The Zarthan could not map what refused to stay static. He glanced at her. "You sure about this?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "No, but hesitation is how you lose wars." He nodded once. That was answer enough. Above them, the trap was already in motion. Orzathal's soldiers stood at their posts, scanning the ruins, weapons poised. The air was thick with tension, the unspoken certainty that something was coming. When the first explosion hit, it was not from above, but beneath. A sudden, deafening rupture of stone and steel as the ground collapsed under an entire squad, swallowing them whole. The Zarthan reacted instantly, shifting formation, adjusting their scans. Another detonation rocked the field, not an attack, but manipulation, walls caving in, streets diverting their paths. They were being funneled. Orzathal's mind processed the data in real time, assembling a counter-strategy. They wanted him to retreat, to fall back into safer ground where they could dictate the terms of engagement. He would not. "Full advance," he ordered. "Force them into exposure." His soldiers obeyed without question, pushing forward into the shifting battlefield. They expected resistance, gunfire, explosives, the usual human desperation. Instead, they were met with silence. Orzathal understood his mistake a second too late. The humans had anticipated his adaptation. This was not an ambush. It was an evacuation. The resistance was gone. He activated his scanner, running a full analysis of the area. Residual energy signatures, scattered footprints, signs of movement, all pointed to a withdrawal carried out with almost surgical precision. They had dismantled their own positions before his forces had arrived, ensuring there was nothing left to recover. No bodies, no prisoners, no trace of their next move. A distraction, and he had fallen for it. He clenched his jaw. They were bleeding his forces, not through direct conflict, but through exhaustion, through misdirection. They were dragging the war out, turning it into something that could not be measured in statistics or probabilities. A war of attrition, not of weapons, but of patience. A new transmission cut through the static. "You should have left when you had the chance." The voice was the same as before. Steady, amused, not gloating, not taunting, simply stating a fact. Orzith did not crush the receiver this time. He listened. "Your army isn't designed for this," the voice continued. "You're built for conquest, not endurance. And every second you stay here, you lose more than troops." A pause. "You lose control." He should have felt anger. Instead, he felt something colder. A realization. The war was no longer about territory. It was about time, and the humans were winning. The Zarthan had never lost a war. Until now, defeat had been a concept that belonged to other species, primitive civilizations that lacked the discipline to survive, the intelligence to evolve, the ruthlessness to rule. Conquest was not a question of if, but when. The universe belonged to the strong, and the Zarthan had always been the strongest. Yet, as Orzith stood in the command chamber of his failing occupation, he knew that something had gone terribly wrong. The battle should have been over weeks ago, but the humans refused to break. Worse, they refused to fight in a way he could quantify. He had studied warfare his entire existence, had mapped out every strategy, every countermeasure, had dissected the rise and fall of thousands of worlds. And yet, this war, this enemy, eluded him. The hollow displays around him flickered, streams of data cascading in real time. His forces were in disarray. Patrols moved in circles, following false coordinates planted by human infiltrators. Supply lines were compromised before they could be reinforced. Even the most basic military protocols, communication, regrouping, fortification, had become unreliable. But it was not the losses that disturbed him. It was the silence. For the past 3 days, the resistance had ceased their attacks. No ambushes, no explosions, no whispered transmissions mocking his failures. The humans had vanished into the ruins like smoke dissipating in the wind. His soldiers should have felt relief, yet their efficiency continued to decline. They were becoming slower, hesitant, waiting. Orzith did not believe in waiting. A figure approached, one of his officers, moving with the controlled precision expected of the Zarthan elite. Yet even through the seamless discipline, Orzith could see it, the unease, the subtle flicker of something foreign to their kind. The officer saluted. "Supreme Strategist, we have completed another sweep of the lower districts. No enemy activity detected." Orzith turned to face him fully. No bodies, no pause, no signs of habitation either. That was the problem. Humans did not simply disappear. They are preparing for something. Orzith said, "We are not dealing with a retreat. This is misdirection." The officer nodded, but his posture remained rigid, as if unwilling to say what weighed on his mind. Orzith recognized the hesitation. He had seen it before, an affliction spreading through his ranks like a slow disease. "Speak," he ordered. The officer hesitated for only a second. "There have been disturbances, defined disturbances, equipment failures, tactical systems reporting contradictory orders, neural relays experiencing static interference." Orzith jaw tightened. "Sabotage." No, another pause. "We cannot trace the origin. It is as if the commands are being rewritten mid-execution." The commander's hands curled into fists. This was not the work of humans. Their technology, while adaptable, lacked the precision to infiltrate Zarthan systems so completely. This was something else, an unknown variable. He dismissed the officer with a curt nod, turning back to the tactical displays. The longer he studied the readouts, the more the patterns unraveled before him. It was subtle at first, delayed responses from reconnaissance units, minuscule deviations in squad formations. But when he widened the data field, he saw the truth. It was not just his soldiers that were faltering. The entire invasion force was degrading. From the lowest foot soldier to the command hierarchy itself, his forces were losing cohesion. Their synchronization, once perfect, now carried micro-delays, infinitesimal hesitations that should not exist. No Zarthan questioned orders. No Zarthan faltered. And yet they were. He was running out of time. A soft chime signaled an incoming transmission. This time, the voice was not human. supreme strategist. The deep resonance of high command filled the chamber. The direct intervention of the Zarthan elite was rare, a sign that patience had worn thin. You have deviated from the projected timeline, the voice continued. Explain. For the first time in his existence, Orzith Kal hesitated. Not out of fear. Fear was an inefficient emotion, eradicated from their kind long ago, but out of something deeper. A realization that he did not have an explanation that would satisfy them. This war has taken an unforeseen path, he said carefully. The humans have proven anomalous. Clarify. Orzith Kal's fingers hovered over the display, pulling up the conflicting reports, the inconsistencies that should not exist. Their resistance has shifted beyond conventional understanding. Their tactics do not rely on strength, nor even strategy, but disruption. We are not fighting an enemy. We are fighting the erosion of certainty itself. There was a pause. Then the response. Terminate the engagement. Orzith Kal stiffened. You are ordering retreat? No. You have failed to secure planetary compliance through calculated force. Proceed with planetary sterilization. The words settled like stone. Sterilization. The annihilation of Earth's ecosystem. The eradication of its people. Not through war, but through the silent efficiency of atmospheric collapse. A purge. His mind processed the order instantly. It was logical, efficient. If occupation was unattainable, then the planet would be rendered uninhabitable. The resources would be extracted, the ruins left as a warning for any future resistance. He had executed similar commands before, without hesitation, without question. Yet now, as he stood in the remains of this fractured city, he found himself staring at the data before him, at the human anomalies that refused to be categorized, at the resilience that defied probability, at the silence that was not surrender, but calculation. The humans were waiting for something. For the first time in his existence, Orzith Kal considered a possibility he had never entertained before. What if the Zarthan were not the only ones capable of adaptation? His fingers hovered over the command relay. One signal would begin the process, the first step in turning Earth into a wasteland. It would be simple, and yet a single thought coiled in his mind, refusing to be silenced. What if this is what they wanted? If the resistance had been unpredictable before, what would they do when faced with annihilation? If they had been willing to bleed the Zarthan army dry in a war of attrition, what would they do when they had nothing left to lose? His kind did not believe in emotion, but strategy was not emotion. Yet for the first time, Orzith Kal realized he was no longer certain of the outcome. The war was not over. It had only just begun. The sky above Earth had once been crowded with Zarthan warships, massive constructs of metal and power, eclipsing the sun as they descended. Now, those same ships hung in stillness, their formations broken, their command channels filled with static and uncertainty. What had been an unshakable occupation force was unraveling, not from superior firepower, but from something far more insidious. Doubt. Orzith Kal stood in the center of his war room, watching the data feeds distort and contradict themselves. His hands remained motionless at his sides, his expression unreadable behind his helmet, but inside, his mind was churning. This was no longer a campaign. It was something else. A slow erosion of order, a dismantling of control, not through open rebellion, but through the relentless, suffocating grip of disorder. His orders from high command had been clear: sterilization. If conquest was unattainable, the planet would be purged, its resources extracted, its surface rendered lifeless. It was logical, efficient, the standard protocol for dealing with resistance too costly to subdue. And yet, he hesitated. His hesitation did not come from morality. Zarthan did not possess such weaknesses. It did not come from mercy. Mercy was an obstacle, a failing of lesser beings. It came from calculation, from the cold, undeniable fact that nothing about this war had followed the projections. If he followed protocol, if he initiated the purge, what would the humans do? Their tactics had been shaped by desperation, but desperation had given them something he could not counter. It had made them fluid, unpredictable, unbreakable in ways that defied logic. They did not fight for survival. They fought to confound, and they had succeeded. His forces were no longer fully obeying commands. The neural precision that made Zarthan troops superior had begun to waver. Soldiers were slow to react. Data streams were corrupted before they could be received. Orders were revised mid-execution without any traceable interference. They were losing control of themselves. He turned sharply as his second-in-command approached, her posture rigid, yet there was something in the angle of her shoulders, something barely perceptible. Hesitation, a flaw, supreme strategist. Her voice was clipped precise. The purification protocols are ready. We await your authorization. The words were expected. So was his response. He was the highest-ranking officer on the ground. His orders would be final. And yet, he activated a private channel, bypassing standard security layers, connecting him to high command directly. A moment later, the familiar, emotionless voice of his superior filled the space. You have delayed execution of the sterilization order. Explain. Orzith did not shift. The operation has deviated from projections. Non-compliance with orders is deviation. Execution will correct the error. They are manipulating us. There was silence on the other end. Then clarify. They have done something to our systems. Our networks rewrite themselves. Directives alter without traceable interference. Our troops falter, not from exhaustion, not from rebellion, but from something deeper. His voice remained level, though inside, a realization was beginning to form. The longer we remain, the weaker we become. A pause. Then, your analysis has been noted. Initiate planetary sterilization. A test. They did not believe him. Or perhaps they did, and they did not care. Zarthan doctrine dictated that conquest was absolute. If a world resisted, it was purged. There had never been an exception. Orzith ended the transmission. For the first time in his existence, he stood at the center of two orders that could not coexist. He could execute the purge, burn the planet to ash, and preserve what was left of his command's integrity. Or he could disobey. The word had never held meaning to him before. It had never been possible. Zarthan's soldiers did not question. They did not doubt. They did not disobey. But he was not blind. If the humans had infiltrated them this deeply, if their resistance had spread, not just through physical warfare, but into the very structure of the Zarthan's own systems, then this war was no longer winnable. The purge would not cleanse it. It would spread it. A flicker of motion in his periphery. His second-in-command remained at attention, waiting for confirmation. But now, as he studied her, he saw it. The delay in her breath. The faintest twitch of her fingers. A hesitation so minute that no lesser strategist would have noticed it. She was waiting too. He exhaled, a quiet sound beneath his helmet. Then, with perfect precision, he turned and issued his final command. All units. His voice did not waver. We are leaving. The words carried through every surviving Zarthan channel, slicing through the static, through the lingering remnants of corrupted transmissions. In the silence that followed, there was no protest, no questioning, only compliance. The retreat began at once. Across the ruined cities, Zarthan warships shifted course, engines igniting as fleets began their withdrawal. Troops disengaged without further conflict, moving in synchronized efficiency, but Orzith could see it now. Their once perfect cohesion had fractures. The subtle, unavoidable truth. They had already lost. And as the Zarthan ships lifted into the sky, as the war came to an end, Orzith looked down at the world below, the world that had undone them. The humans had never needed to win. They had only needed to make staying impossible. He did not understand them, but he understood this. The Zarthan Empire would remember Earth, and they would never return.